hoping a new analyst position would finally pay enough to keep the heat on for his 4-year-old daughter. Alexander had gambled his last $40 on a thrifted suit, one currently bearing a noticeable stain from baby formula. He was waiting at the lobby elevators, thoroughly defeated after a disastrous interview where the recruiter had practically laughed in his face when the executive suite's heavy mahogany doors suddenly flew open. To his shock, the CEO herself came sprinting down the corridor. Alexander adjusted the knot of his tie in the scratched bathroom mirror. It was a half-inch too wide, a relic from a decade ago, bought at a Goodwill out in Queens. The fabric felt stiff, cheap, like cardboard against his throat. "Dinosaur," Maya demanded from the floor. Alexander looked down. His 4-year-old daughter was sitting on the peeling linoleum, holding up a plastic T-Rex missing half its tail. She had a smudge of oatmeal on her left cheek. "Roar," Alexander said, his voice flat, devoid of the energy she deserved. He crouched, wiped the oatmeal off her face with his thumb, and kissed her forehead. "Daddy has to go to a meeting, Bug. A very important meeting." Maya stared at him. "Bring back a big dinosaur. If I get this job, I'll bring back the biggest dinosaur they sell." He didn't believe it. The cynicism had settled into his bones 3 years ago, right around the time his wife walked out, leaving nothing but an empty closet and a stack of unpaid medical bills from her elective surgeries. Since then, Alexander had been out of the corporate game. 3 years is a lifetime in supply chain logistics. Algorithms change, software updates. You become obsolete. Alexander dropped Maya off at Mrs. Higgins's apartment down the hall, handing the elderly woman a crumpled $20 bill. It was half his net worth. The subway ride into Manhattan was a suffocating blur of damp wool and body odor. Alexander reviewed his resume on his cracked phone screen. It looked pathetic. Alexander Pendelton, Senior Logistics Coordinator, followed by a gaping 3-year void. He had tried to fill it with freelance consulting gigs, but HR algorithms weren't stupid. They saw the gap. They smelled the desperation. Montgomery Logistics occupied 70 floors of prime midtown real estate. The lobby was an intimidating expanse of white marble and brushed steel. It felt less like a workplace and more like a mausoleum for human empathy. Alexander checked in with security, feeling the weight of the security guard's gaze lingering on his scuffed dress shoes. The interview was on the 42nd floor. The HR manager, a man named Greg whose teeth were aggressively white and whose suit cost more than Alexander's car, didn't even stand up when Alexander walked in. "Alexander," Greg said, flipping through a printed copy of the resume. He didn't look up. "Take a seat." Alexander sat. The chair was low. Greg's desk was high. A classic psychological play. "So," Greg said, finally looking up. His eyes locked onto the faint, crusty stain of baby formula on Alexander's collar. A microscopic sneer twitched on his lips. 3 years out of the industry. That's significant." "I had family obligations," Alexander said. "Keep it brief. Keep it professional." "Right. Family." Greg leaned back, steepling his fingers. "The thing is, Alexander, Montgomery Logistics moves at the speed of light. We don't just manage supply chains, we dictate them. In 3 years, the industry has shifted to predictive AI routing. Are you familiar with the new Oracle integrations?" "I've read the documentation," Alexander said. "The underlying principles of node-based routing remain the same. Freight still has to move from point A to point B." "Read the documentation," Greg repeated, chuckling softly. "Well, that's great. Look, Alexander, we need someone who can hit the ground running. We're dealing with a massive bottleneck in our European distribution network right now. We don't have time to train someone who's been out of the loop." "I don't need training," Alexander said, his voice tightening. He needed this job. The electric bill was due Tuesday. The eviction notice would follow by Friday. "Give me a scenario. Let me show you." Greg sighed, checking his Rolex. "We have a strict schedule today. Honestly, Alexander, I don't think you're a cultural fit for Montgomery. We need hungry, aggressive talent, not baggage." The word hung in the air. Baggage. Alexander felt the heat rising in his neck. He looked at Greg, really looked at him. The perfect haircut, the arrogance, the utter lack of understanding of what it took to keep a human being alive on nothing but sheer will and tap water. "I see," Alexander said. He stood up. There was no point in begging. Begging never worked on men like Greg. "Thank you for your time. Good luck out there," Greg said, already typing on his computer. Alexander walked out of the glass-walled office. The bullpen outside was loud, chaotic. He felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. It was over. He had failed. He walked down the corridor toward the elevators, his mind racing through terrible calculations. Pawn the watch, sell the car, maybe find a night shift at a warehouse. As he walked, he passed a massive, floor-to-ceiling glass whiteboard in the hallway. It was covered in a complex web of shipping routes marked with red dry erase marker. A bold heading read, "Frankfurt Bottleneck, critical." Alexander stopped. He couldn't help it. His brain, dormant for 3 years, snapped into focus. He looked at the red lines. It was a mess. They were trying to route heavy freight through a centralized hub in Munich before distributing to Eastern Europe, completely ignoring the seasonal union strikes in the German rail sector and the newly opened deep-water port in Gdansk. It was amateur hour. Alexander looked around. A blue dry erase marker sat on the ledge. Without thinking, driven by a mix of raw frustration and the pure mechanical itch to fix something broken, Alexander picked it up. He didn't erase their work. He simply drew a bold, heavy blue line directly from the Atlantic shipping lane, bypassing Munich entirely, hooking up through Gdansk and branching out into a localized truck and rail micro-network. He scribbled a single equation next to it calculating the tariff offset versus fuel savings. He dropped the marker. It clattered loudly on the ledge. Alexander turned and walked into the elevator bay. He pressed the down button. The doors opened. He stepped inside, the metal doors sliding shut, sealing him away from the corporate world he no longer belonged to. Claire Montgomery was 34, worth roughly $2 billion, and she wanted to fire every single person on the 42nd floor. She stood in her corner office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. She held a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Her head throbbed. 10 years ago, Claire had built this company from a laptop in a cramped Boston apartment. She had coded the original routing algorithms herself. She knew the business in her blood. But as the company grew, it became infected with corporate bloat. Vice presidents of synergy, directors of paradigm shifts, MBAs who knew how to make a PowerPoint look beautiful but couldn't route a cardboard box out of a paper bag. The Frankfurt bottleneck was bleeding them dry to the tune of $4 million a week, and her senior logistics team had spent the last 3 days arguing about it in the hallway. Claire turned away from the window. She was wearing a sharp navy blazer and slacks. No jewelry. She didn't have time for accessories. She hit the intercom on her desk. "Sarah, where is the updated brief from the logistics team?" "They're still working on the whiteboard, Ms. Montgomery." Her assistant's voice crackled back, sounding terrified. "They said they need another 48 hours to run the simulations." 48 hours, Claire muttered. "I'll do it my damn self." She marched out of her office. The executive floor was quiet, insulated by thick carpets and acoustic panels. She bypassed her private elevator and took the internal stairs down to 42. When Claire stepped onto the operations floor, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Conversation stopped. People looked busy, staring intently at their monitors. Claire ignored them. She walked straight down the main corridor toward the glass whiteboard where her senior team had been struggling all week. She stopped in front of it. Her eyes scanned the red marker. It was the same garbage they'd pitched yesterday. Munich. It was always Munich with these idiots. Then, she saw the blue line. Claire stepped closer. She traced the bold blue ink with her eyes. Gdansk. Her breath hitched slightly. The sheer simplicity of it. Bypass the rail strikes, eat the higher maritime docking fee in Poland, but offset it with localized trucking, which had currently cratered in price due to the regional fuel subsidies. She looked at the equation scribbled in the corner. She did the math in her head. It wasn't just a solution. It was a beautiful, elegant, aggressive solution. It cut the delivery time by 3 days and saved them at least 15% on the gross margin. "Who did this?" Claire demanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the bullpen like a whip. A few heads popped up over their cubicles. Silence. "I asked a question," Claire said, turning around. "Who drew the blue line?" Greg, the HR manager, poked his head out of his glass office. He saw the CEO standing there and immediately broke into a sweat. He scurried over, smoothing his tie. "Ms. Montgomery," Greg stammered. "We didn't expect you down here." "The whiteboard, Greg," Claire pointed. "Who put this up here?" Greg looked at the board, confused. I'm not sure. The senior analysts were looking at it earlier, but..." He paused, his eyes widening as he remembered the man who had just walked by. "Wait, there was a candidate. Just left my office." "A candidate?" Claire's eyes narrowed. "For the mid-level analyst role?" "Yes, but I passed on him. He wasn't a fit." "You passed on him." Claire stared at Greg. "Why?" "He had a 3-year gap on his resume, Ms. Montgomery. He's been out of the game. Plus, he looked disheveled. Honestly, he came in here smelling like a laundromat and had some kind of stain on his collar. He's not Montgomery material." Claire looked back at the board. The math was flawless. The instincts were razor sharp. She didn't give a damn if the man came in wearing a garbage bag. "What was his name?" Claire asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Alexander. Alexander Pendelton. How long ago did he leave?" "Just now. He's probably waiting for the elevator." Claire didn't say another word. She shoved past Greg. "Ms. Montgomery, you have a board meeting in 10 minutes. Greg called out, panicked. "Cancel it." Claire barked over her shoulder. She hit the elevator bay, just as the digital display for car number 3 clicked to lobby. Claire slammed her palm against the call button, but the remaining cars were all stuck on higher floors. She let out a frustrated curse, pushed open the heavy fire door, and took the stairs. 42 flights. She didn't care. She was not letting a mind like that walk out of her building to go work for Amazon or FedEx. Alexander stepped out of the brass-trimmed elevator into the cavernous lobby. The cold, conditioned air hit him, a stark contrast to the boiling anxiety inside his chest. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his cheap trousers. He had to call Mrs. Higgins. He had to tell her he'd be late with next week's childcare money. He pulled out his phone. The battery was at 12%. Typical. He walked out through the revolving glass doors onto 6th Avenue. The midday Manhattan heat slapped him in the face. It smelled like roasting nuts, exhaust fumes, and hot garbage. The sidewalks were packed with people moving with purpose. People with jobs, people with places to be. Alexander just stood there for a second, letting the current of the crowd flow around him. He felt entirely hollowed out. Baggage. Greg's voice echoed in his head. Maybe Greg was right. He was 36, raising a kid alone, entirely disconnected from the modern rhythm of the world. He started walking north, toward the subway station. His shoulders slumped. Inside the building, The fire door on the ground floor burst open. Claire stumbled into the lobby, her chest heaving, her calves burning from the 42-story sprint. A security guard rushed forward. "Ms. Montgomery, are you all right?" "Where?" Claire gasped, holding up a hand to stop him. "Is the man who just came down in car 3? Tall guy? Cheap suit?" The guard pointed toward the revolving doors. "Just walked out." Claire didn't stop. She pushed through the revolving doors, her high heels clicking frantically on the marble, then hitting the concrete pavement outside. The sunlight temporarily blinded her. She scanned the sea of pedestrians, suits, tourists, delivery guys. Then she saw him. Broad shoulders, a suit jacket that didn't fit right. He was about half a block away, walking slow, head down. "Pendelton!" Claire yelled. The street was too loud. A garbage truck groaned past, drowning her out. Claire abandoned all pretense of corporate dignity. She started to run. She dodged a hot dog vendor, bumped into a startled tourist, and ignored a cab driver who honked at her. "Alexander Pendelton!" Alexander paused. He thought he heard his name, but dismissed it. Nobody in this city knew him. He kept walking toward the subway stairs. A hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him backward. Alexander spun around, startled, his fists instinctively clenching. He found himself staring at a woman in a sharp navy blazer. She was breathing hard, a slight sheen of sweat on her forehead. Her dark hair was slightly messy from the run, but it was her eyes that caught him. They were piercing, relentless, and entirely focused on him. "Gdansk," she panted, leaning over slightly to catch her breath. Alexander blinked. "Excuse me? You routed the heavy freight through Gdansk," Claire said, standing up straight, regaining her composure. She looked him up and down. Greg was right about the suit. But Greg was an idiot. Up close, Alexander didn't look defeated. He looked exhausted, sure, but there was a hardened, intelligent edge to his jaw. "I don't know who you are, lady," Alexander said, taking a step back, highly defensive. "I'm just trying to get to the subway." "I'm Claire Montgomery," she said. Alexander froze. The name hit him. Montgomery Logistics. He looked at her again. The CEO, the billionaire. He had read articles about her. She rarely gave interviews. She was known as a ruthless operator. "Why are you chasing me down the street?" Alexander asked, his voice guarded. "Did I vandalize the whiteboard? Is that it? Bill me for the marker." Claire actually let out a short, sharp laugh. "I don't care about the marker. I care about the fact that my senior analytics team has been staring at that board for 3 days and couldn't figure out a solution that you scribbled down in 30 seconds on your way out the door." Alexander swallowed hard. He looked away, watching the traffic blur past. "Your HR guy told me I wasn't a cultural fit. Said I had too much baggage." "Greg is a moron," Claire said bluntly. "I pay him to filter resumes, not to think. I do the thinking, and right now I'm thinking that equation you wrote for the fuel offset was the smartest thing I've seen in my company in 5 years. Alexander looked back at her. The cynicism in him wanted to walk away. He was tired of games. "What do you want, Ms. Montgomery?" "I want you to turn around, walk back into my building, and fix my European network." "I have a 4-year-old daughter," Alexander said, the truth spilling out of him like a defensive shield. "I don't have a nanny. I don't have a wife. I drop her off at a neighbor's apartment. If she gets sick, I leave work. If her school calls, I leave work. I haven't worked in 3 years because I was keeping her alive. That's my baggage." Claire stared at him. The noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. She looked at the faint stain on his collar. She didn't see weakness. She saw a man who had sacrificed everything for duty. She saw loyalty. In the corporate world, Loyalty was a ghost. "Mr. Pendelton," Claire said, her voice dropping, losing the sharp executive edge and becoming deeply human. "I run a $2 billion empire. If your daughter gets sick, we'll build a damn pediatric clinic in the lobby. Do you want the job or not?" The elevator ride back up to the executive suite was painfully silent. Alexander stood 2 feet away from Claire Montgomery, staring at the brass floor indicator as it ticked past the 30s. He was acutely aware of the sour smell of formula on his collar and the way his dress shoes squeaked slightly on the marble floor. Claire didn't look at him. She was typing furiously on her phone, her thumb moving in a blur. "I don't have a degree from MIT, Alexander said to the doors. It was a preemptive strike, a defense mechanism. "I don't care if you have a degree from a cereal box," Claire replied, not looking up. "Degrees teach you how the world should work. I need someone who knows how it actually works when everything goes to hell." The doors chimed on the 70th floor. Not 42, 70. This was the airlock. The floors were covered in a muted charcoal carpet that swallowed sound. The walls were paneled in dark, raw-edge walnut. No cubicles, just wide, sweeping sight lines and millions of dollars of understated art. Claire walked past a reception desk where a young man in a tailored suit immediately stood up. "Ms. Montgomery, the board is waiting in conference room A. Tell them I'm rescheduling." "Again," Claire said without breaking stride. "And call down to HR. Tell Greg that Alexander Pendelton is now the Director of European Routing, effective 10 minutes ago." Alexander stopped dead in his tracks. The receptionist blinked, his eyes darting to Alexander's wrinkled suit. "Director?" Alexander said. His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat. "I applied for a mid-level analyst role." Claire turned around. "The mid-level analysts are the ones who drew that bloodbath of a map in the hallway. You're going to fix it. That makes you the director." She pointed to a glass-walled office 3 doors down from hers. It was empty, save for a massive teak desk and 3 curved monitors. "That's your office. The starting salary is $240,000, plus equity. Is that going to cover the babysitter?" Alexander felt the floor tilt. 240,000. It wasn't just a number. It was a pardon. It was a reprieve from the suffocating, drowning weight he had carried for 3 years. It meant groceries without a calculator. It meant keeping the heat at 70 degrees in February. It meant Maya could get the good winter boots, not the plastic ones that leaked at the seams. He swallowed the lump in his throat. He couldn't let her see the desperation. "It'll cover it." "Good." Claire walked into her office. "You have access to the mainframe. The credentials will be sent to your terminal in 5 minutes. I want a full cost-benefit breakdown of the Dansk route by 4 o'clock. Alexander walked into his new office. He closed the glass door. The silence in the room was heavy, expensive. He sat in the ergonomic leather chair. It molded to his spine. He put his head in his hands, resting his elbows on the cool teak wood. And for the first time in 36 months, he let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. 10 minutes later, the screens blinked to life. A blinking cursor demanded a login. Alexander cracked his knuckles. The imposter syndrome was screaming in his ear, telling him he was a fraud, a ghost who had accidentally wandered into a machine. He ignored it. He brought up the European topographical maps, overlaying the shipping manifests, fuel indexes, and local union dockets. The math didn't care about his cheap suit. The numbers didn't care that his wife had left him. Logistics was a brutal, honest language. Freight was heavy. Asphalt was hard. Distance cost money. He lost himself in the grid. He bypassed Munich. He found a secondary rail line running out of Poland that was heavily subsidized by the local government for industrial use. He factored in the maritime docking fees, the weather patterns over the Baltic Sea, the depreciation of the truck fleet. At 3:45 p.m., he printed the report. He walked into Claire's office and dropped the folder on her desk. 15 minutes early, she said, opening it. Her eyes scanned the spreadsheets. Alexander watched her. She didn't skim. She read the raw data, her mind processing the variables with terrifying speed. You factored in a 2% margin of error for weather delays in the Baltic, she noted, her finger tapping the page. Why? Because it's storm season, Alexander said. The analysts used a flat annual average for transit times. That's a mistake. A flat average doesn't account for a sudden squall knocking a container ship off schedule by 12 hours. If we hit a storm, we bleed time. I pre-booked warehouse space at the Dansk port at a discount rate. If the ship is late, the trucks don't idle on the clock. They drop previous loads and pick up the delayed freight seamlessly. Claire closed the folder. She looked at him, really looked at him. Greg was an idiot, she said softly. Alexander checked his watch. It was a scratched Timex. It's 4:30, Miss Montgomery. Call me Claire. Claire, I have to go. She frowned. The day isn't over. We need to present this to the European VP. I told you, Alexander said, his voice firm, unyielding. I have a 4-year-old. My neighbor watches her until 5. If I don't catch the 4:45 train, I'm late. And I am never late for Maya. The air in the room tensed. In this building, people slept under their desks. They missed birthdays, anniversaries, and funerals for Montgomery logistics. Claire stared at him. The silence stretched. Fine, Claire said. Take the report. We present it tomorrow at 9. Don't be late. Alexander nodded. He walked out, took the elevator down to the lobby, and headed for the subway. He wasn't a ghost anymore. 3 weeks later, the system was working. Alexander's Gdansk route had cut the Frankfurt bottleneck in half. The red line on the budget was shrinking, turning a healthy, aggressive black. He had bought a new suit, just one, a decent charcoal gray that actually fit his shoulders, and paid off Mrs. Higgins for 6 months in advance. He was surviving. More than that, he was competent. But the executive floor was a shark tank. The legacy vice presidents, men who had been with Claire's father before she took over, resented Alexander. He was the CEO's pet project, the stray dog she dragged in from the street. They waited for him to fail, watching his every move with predatory patience. It was a Tuesday morning when the delicate balance snapped. Alexander's phone buzzed at 6 a.m. It was Mrs. Higgins' daughter. Mrs. Higgins had fallen in the bathroom. Paramedics were taking her to the hospital. She was going to be fine, but she couldn't watch Maya. Alexander stood in his tiny kitchen in Queens, the phone pressed to his ear, a cold dread washing over him. He had the quarterly logistics review at 10 a.m. It was his first time presenting to the full board. If he didn't show up, the VPs would use it as ammunition to rip his Dansk model apart. He looked down at Maya. She was eating dry Cheerios out of a plastic bowl, wearing a mismatched pajama set. "Daddy," she said, holding up a Cheerio. "Look, a wheel." Alexander made a decision. It was a terrible, desperate decision, but the only one he had. At 8:30 a.m., Alexander walked off the 70th floor elevator. He was wearing his charcoal suit, and his right hand was tightly gripping the sticky, small hand of a 4-year-old girl, holding a plush, one-eyed triceratops. The receptionist's jaw practically unhinged. "Mr. Pendelton, is that a child?" "No, it's a localized freight anomaly," Alexander said deadpan. "We're going to my office." He ushered Maya into his glass office. He set up his iPad on the floor, put on an animated movie about talking cars, and handed her a box of crayons and a stack of printed, discarded spreadsheets. "Okay, Bug," Alexander said, kneeling down. "Daddy has to go into that big room next door. I will be right there. You can see me through the glass. Do not leave this room. Draw on the back of the papers. Maya nodded solemnly, already engrossed in a blue crayon. Alexander grabbed his presentation notes and walked out. The board meeting was brutal. The VPs attacked the margins, questioning his fuel projections, demanding stress tests on the trucking contracts. Alexander fought back with raw, undisputed data. He knew the numbers in his sleep. He parried every thrust, his eyes occasionally darting to the glass wall to check on Maya. She was coloring diligently. At 11:15 a.m., the meeting broke. Alexander had won the room, begrudgingly. The VPs filed out, muttering about unorthodox methodology. Alexander let out an exhausted sigh and walked out into the corridor. He stopped. Through the glass of his office, he saw Claire. She was sitting in his ergonomic leather chair. Maya was standing next to her, holding up a spreadsheet. Alexander rushed into the office. "Claire, I am so sorry. My childcare fell through an hour before the train." Claire held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the paper Maya had handed her. Maya had taken a blue crayon and drawn a massive, chaotic scribble directly over Alexander's projected Q3 shipping manifest. "Is this a dinosaur?" Claire asked the little girl. Her tone wasn't baby talk. It was serious, inquisitive. "It's a T-Rex," Maya corrected. "He's eating the numbers." "I see," Claire said. "The numbers are very crunchy." "Yeah." Maya pointed to a section of the spreadsheet. "He ate that one." Claire looked up at Alexander. The legendary ruthless billionaire CEO had a smudge of blue crayon on her thumb. "I can explain," Alexander started, his chest tightening. "I didn't have a choice. I couldn't miss the board meeting and I couldn't leave her." Claire stood up. She smoothed her blazer. "Alexander, relax." She walked around the desk, looking down at Maya's drawing. "When I was 7, my father used to bring me into this building. He would lock me in his office while he negotiated maritime contracts. I used to build forts out of the empty shipping boxes he kept as samples." Alexander blinked, surprised by the sudden vulnerability. It was the first time she had mentioned anything personal. "This industry takes everything you give it," Claire said, looking out the window at the skyline. "It demands your time, your sleep, your sanity. My father built a logistics empire, but he forgot how to be a father. He routed ships flawlessly, but he couldn't find his way to my piano recitals." She turned back to Alexander. The sharp, cynical edge in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. "You didn't hide her," Claire said. "You didn't call in sick and make excuses. You brought her here and you still went in there and dismantled 3 VPs who have 20 years of experience on you." "She's my priority," Alexander said softly. "The job pays the rent, but she's the reason the rent matters." Claire nodded slowly. "I told you on the street, Alexander. If she gets sick, we build a clinic. If you lose your sitter, she draws on the Q3 projections. Do not ever apologize to me for being a father." She looked down at Maya. "Your T-Rex has excellent taste in data, Maya." Maya beamed. Claire walked out of the office, leaving Alexander standing there. The heavy weight in his chest completely dissolved. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He felt like he belonged. Summer bled into a brutal, unforgiving autumn. The chill in the New York air mirrored the rising tension on the operations floor. Alexander's Gdansk route had been operating flawlessly for 4 months. He was respected by the analysts, feared by the VPs, and had settled into a quiet, heavily caffeinated rhythm. Maya was thriving in a proper preschool. Things were stable, which meant inevitably the bottom had to fall out. It started with a flashing red light on Alexander's terminal at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. A maritime union dispute in the Polish shipyards. It wasn't a strike. It was a work-to-rule protest. The crane operators were moving at exactly half speed, citing safety regulations. 50,000 tons of Montgomery logistics freight, largely consisting of high-margin consumer electronics slated for the holiday rush, was sitting on a cargo ship in the Baltic Sea, waiting to dock. The queue was backing up. The delay was estimated at 96 hours. In supply chain logistics, 96 hours is a death sentence. Contracts contained penalty clauses. If the electronics didn't hit the distribution centers by Monday, Montgomery Logistics was on the hook for millions in breach of contract fines. The executive floor erupted. Alexander was summoned to the main boardroom. The room was tense, the air practically humming with adrenaline and anger. Claire sat at the head of the long oak table, her face an unreadable mask. Greg, from HR, was there, inexplicably, sitting next to Marcus, the VP of European Operations, who had opposed Alexander from day one. "This is exactly what we warned you about, Claire," Marcus was saying as Alexander walked in. "The Gdansk route was a gimmick. It lacked redundancy. Now we have $40 million of client product floating in the ocean, and the port authority is telling us to go screw ourselves." "Have a seat, Alexander," Claire said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were flinty. Alexander sat. He opened his laptop. He had been crunching numbers for the last 20 minutes. "Why, what's the play, Pendelton?" Marcus sneered. "Going to draw another magic blue line on a whiteboard. The penalty clauses kick in at midnight on Sunday. We are hemorrhaging cash by the hour." Alexander ignored Marcus. He looked directly at Claire. "The Polish crane operators are stalling," Alexander said, pulling up a satellite feed of the port. "They aren't going to speed up. Throwing money at the union bosses won't work. This is a grassroots safety protest. They have the leverage." "So we're dead," Greg chimed in, trying to sound important. "We have to issue the failure notices to the clients." "No," Alexander said. The word was flat, absolute. He keyed a command into his laptop, projecting his screen onto the main monitor. A map of the Baltic coastline appeared. "We don't dock in Gdansk," Alexander said. Marcus laughed. "Brilliant. Let's just teach the cargo ship to fly. We reroute to Klaipėda. It's a deep-water port in Lithuania, about 200 miles up the coast," Alexander explained, tracing a new path with his cursor. "They aren't unionized under the same umbrella. Their cranes are operating at full capacity." "Lithuania?" Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "Our trucking network is staged in Poland. You want to dump 40 million in electronics in a Lithuanian port. How do you get it to the German distribution hubs? The rail gauge changes at the border, you idiot. You can't just put it on a train." "I'm not putting it on a train," Alexander said, his voice rising, cutting through the boardroom panic with the heavy, undeniable weight of street-level grit. "I'm putting it on flatbeds." He brought up a new spreadsheet. It wasn't clean corporate data. It was raw, messy, and real. "During the 3 years I was out of this industry," Alexander said, looking around the room, making eye contact with every executive who had doubted him. "I did freelance logistics for independent trucking syndicates, the guys who haul timber and raw steel across Eastern Europe. They don't use the main highways, they use the secondary arterial roads. They don't have corporate contracts, they operate on cash and diesel." He looked at Claire. "I made 6 phone calls on the way down the hall. I tapped into an independent dispatcher in Warsaw. We are currently mobilizing 75 independent flatbed trucks. They will cross the Lithuanian border tonight, empty. They'll hit the Klaipėda port by morning. The ship diverts now, docks tomorrow at 6 a.m., offloads directly onto the flatbeds." Silence fell over the boardroom. "And the transit time?" Claire asked, her voice quiet, calculating. "They drive in tandem teams. No stops except for fuel," Alexander said. "They bypass the way stations by taking the D-class roads through the rural corridors. It's rougher on the axles, but they'll make up the time. They hit the German hubs by Sunday night, 12 hours before the penalty clauses trigger. Marcus was pale. You're trusting independent contractors, timber haulers, with high-end consumer electronics. It's too much risk. What if they steal it? What if they break down? They won't, Alexander said, because I'm paying them double the market rate, half up front, half on delivery. The penalty fines for missing the deadline are $12 million. The cost of hiring the independent fleet is $1.2 million. It's a 10-to-1 risk ratio. It's the only play we have. He closed his laptop. The loud click echoed in the silent room. I need authorization for a $1.2 million wire transfer to a Warsaw holding account, Alexander said, looking at Claire. Right now, or the ship misses the window to turn. The room held its breath. Marcus was shaking his head. Greg looked terrified. This wasn't how corporate logistics was done. This was guerrilla warfare. Claire Montgomery stared at Alexander. She saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. He wasn't guessing. He knew the asphalt. He knew the desperation of independent drivers trying to make a living, because he had been one of them. He was using his baggage as a weapon. Claire picked up her phone. She hit a single speed dial button. "Treasury?" A voice answered on speakerphone. "This is Montgomery," Claire said, never breaking eye contact with Alexander. "Authorize a $1.2 million wire transfer. Alexander Pendelton will send you the routing numbers." She hung up. Marcus stood up, disgusted. "If this fails, Claire, the board will demand both of your heads." "If it fails, Marcus," Claire said coldly, "I'll box up my own desk. Now get out of my boardroom. All of you. Except Alexander." The executives filed out, silent and angry. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut. Alexander exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving his hands slightly shaky. Claire leaned back in her chair. She looked at him for a long moment. "Timber haulers," she said softly, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "It's going to work," Alexander said, rubbing his eyes. "I know it is," Claire replied, "because you can't afford to let it fail. Go back to your office, Alexander. Track that ship, and when it docks, I want to be the first one to know." Friday, 04:15 hours. The executive floor was a tomb. The heavy oak doors were shut. The ambient lighting dimmed to a sterile security-grade glow. Inside his glass office, Alexander Pendelton was operating on black coffee and sheer mechanical adrenaline. His monitors cast a harsh blue light across his face. 3 screens, pulling disparate feeds from across Eastern Europe. Screen 1, the maritime tracking system. The cargo vessel Oceanic Vanguard was inching into the Klaipėda port, cutting through the Baltic fog. Screen 2, a raw, unformatted Excel sheet, acting as a makeshift ledger for the Warsaw dispatcher. Screen 3, the internal Montgomery Logistics Communications channel, currently muted to block out the panicked, passive-aggressive pings from the legacy vice presidents. Alexander pressed his phone to his ear, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Henrik, talk to me. Tell me the flatbeds are on the dock." Static crackled through the line. Henrik was a dispatcher who operated out of a cinder-block office in Warsaw. He didn't speak corporate. He spoke diesel. "They are there, Alexander." Henrik's heavy Polish accent pushed through the static. 75 trucks. It looks like a military convoy. The Port Authority is giving us grief about the weight distributions, but my drivers are handling it. A little cash, a little vodka in the right hands. The cranes start loading in 10 minutes. Keep them moving, Henrik. If a truck fills up, it rolls. We don't wait for the convoy to mass. Stagger the departures. Give them a 15-minute buffer so they don't bottleneck at the way stations. Understood. Sleep, Alexander. We drive now. The line clicked dead. Alexander put the phone down. He rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the coarse stubble on his jaw. The door to his office clicked open. Claire walked in. She was wearing the same navy blazer from yesterday, though the sharp lines of her collar were slightly rumpled. She held 2 white paper cups from the street cart downstairs. The corporate espresso machines on floor 70 were broken, and neither of them had the patience to deal with it. She set a cup on Alexander's desk. It smelled like burnt chicory and cheap sugar. It was perfect. "By status?" Claire asked. She didn't sit in the guest chair. She stood behind his desk, looking over his shoulder at the glowing maps. "Ship is docking. Henrik has the flatbeds on the concrete," Alexander said, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. "Loading starts in 10 minutes. We're holding the schedule." "The board is demanding an emergency session at 9 a.m., Claire noted, her voice devoid of panic, just relaying facts. "The legacy VP of Europe has been circulating a memo, suggesting I've lost my mind by trusting a rogue analyst with a shadow fleet." "Let him write memos," Alexander said, his eyes never leaving the maritime tracker. "Memos don't move freight. Axles do." Claire took a sip of her own coffee. She looked at the exhaustion etched deeply into the corners of Alexander's eyes. "Where is Maya?" "Mrs. Higgins is back on her feet," Alexander said softly. "I called her at midnight. Dropped Maya off at her apartment before I came back. I paid her double for the weekend shift." He paused, a heavy sigh escaping his chest. "Maya barely woke up, just squeezed my hand and went back to sleep. I hate doing this to her." "You're keeping the roof over her head, Alexander." "I know." He stared at a blinking green dot in Lithuania. "But she didn't ask for a roof. She asked for her dad. There's a difference." Claire leaned against the edge of the teak desk. The silence between them stretched, thick with the shared understanding of what the corporate grind demanded. It extracted a pound of flesh from everyone. It just took different cuts. From Alexander, it took his time as a father. From Claire, it had taken her youth, her ability to trust, and the luxury of a personal life. "My father used to say that logistics is the architecture of human necessity," Claire said quietly. "People want their phones. They want their winter coats. They want their medicine. They don't care how it gets there. They just expect it to be on the shelf. We are the invisible people who make the world function. It's an ugly, brutal job, Alexander. But it matters." "It matters," Alexander agreed, typing a new command into the terminal to refresh the loading dock manifest. "But it doesn't keep you warm at night." "No," Claire said, looking down at her burnt coffee. "It really doesn't." The terminal chirped, a loud, sharp electronic beep. Alexander's posture snapped rigid. The Excel sheet flashed red. "What is it?" Claire asked, her executive instincts instantly overriding the moment of vulnerability. "Trouble," Alexander muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Henrik just flagged the lead trucks. They've cleared the port, but they've hit a checkpoint on the A1 highway near the Polish border. Lithuanian transport authorities. They're running snap inspections on oversized loads. How long is the delay?" "Yeah, if they go by the book. 3 hours per truck," Alexander said, his voice tightening. "We have a 12-hour cushion before the German penalty clauses trigger. If the lead trucks stall, the whole convoy backs up. We bleed the cushion dry before they even cross into Poland." Claire crossed her arms. "Can Henrik bribe them?" "Not these guys. It's a federal task force. Cameras everywhere." Alexander's eyes darted across the topographical map. He zoomed in on the Suwałki Gap, the narrow stretch of land connecting Poland and Lithuania. He highlighted a thin, winding gray line, cutting through a dense green block of forest. "There," Alexander pointed. "National Road 16. It cuts through the Augusto primeval forest. It's unpaved in sections, mostly gravel and mud. It bypasses the A1 highway entirely. Can a loaded flatbed haul through mud? Claire asked, leaning in close. If the driver knows what he's doing. And Henrik's guys haul timber out of Siberian logging camps. A little Polish mud won't stop them. Alexander picked up his phone. He dialed Warsaw again. But it's going to cost us fuel, and it's going to chew up their tires. We have to authorize a hazard bonus. Do it, Claire said instantly. I don't care if we have to buy them brand new rigs on Monday. Keep the freight moving. Alexander nodded, the phone ringing in his ear. Henrik, divert the convoy. Get them off the A1. We're taking the forest route. Sunday, 20-30 hours. The storm broke over Germany like a fractured dam. Sheets of horizontal rain battered the Munich distribution hub. Inside the main control tower of Montgomery Logistics, the air was thick enough to chew. The digital clock on the wall read 2030. The penalty clauses for the electronics manifest, triggered at exactly midnight. 3.5 hours. Alexander stood at the command center window, staring out at the floodlit asphalt of the receiving yard. The rain was blowing sideways, creating a hazy, chaotic blur over the empty loading bays. Behind him, the executive team had gathered. Like vultures, sensing a carcass, the legacy vice presidents had filtered into the room over the last 2 hours. They stood by the coffee urns, speaking in hushed, conspiratorial tones. They were already drafting the post-mortem. They were already assigning blame. Claire stood next to Alexander. She hadn't left the building since Thursday. She wore a fresh blouse, retrieved from an emergency stash in her office, but her eyes were bloodshot. "Where are they?" she asked quietly, so the vultures couldn't hear. Alexander tapped the glass of a portable tablet in his hand. The GPS trackers were updating agonizingly, slowly. They crossed the German border at 1600 hours. They hit the Autobahn, but this storm cell is slowing them down to 40 miles an hour. The visibility is 0, Alexander said. They are 70 miles out. 70 miles in 3 hours, Claire calculated. It's going to be close. Too close. A slick, grating voice echoed from behind them. The legacy, Phi P of Europe, stepped forward, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He looked incredibly rested. I just spoke with corporate counsel, Claire. We need to begin drafting the force majeure notifications to the clients. If we issue them before midnight, we might be able to mitigate some of the breach of contract fines. Claire didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the rain-slicked yard. We aren't issuing anything. Be reasonable, the VP snapped, dropping the pretense of politeness. This was a catastrophic gamble. You trusted a street-level logistics coordinator to run a shadow operation with untracked timber trucks. Even if they don't crash in this monsoon, they aren't going to make the deadline. We need to cut our losses and fire the people responsible. He glared pointedly at the back of Alexander's head. Alexander felt the exhaustion settling deep in his marrow, the familiar sting of failure. The ghost of 3 years of unemployment whispered in his ear. Maybe the VP was right. Maybe a guy in a cheap suit from Queens couldn't beat the corporate machine. Then, Alexander looked down at his left hand. On his wrist, right next to his scratched Timex, was a messy, blue crayon drawing of a triceratops. Maya had drawn it on his cuff before he dropped her off. "To eat the bad numbers, Daddy," she had said. Alexander's jaw tightened. He wasn't the broken man who had walked into Greg's office months ago. He was the director of European routing. He had run the math. He trusted the math, and he trusted the grit of the men holding the steering wheels in the dark. Alexander spun around. He walked directly up to the VP, violating his personal space by a good 3 inches. "The trucks are 70 miles out," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. "The drivers have been awake for 36 hours. They have chewed through mud, navigated corrupted checkpoints, and they are currently dragging $40 million of our freight through a flash flood." "That proves my point," the VP stammered, taking a step back. "It's a disaster." "It proves," Alexander said, pointing a finger at the man's chest, "that out there on the asphalt, people actually work for a living. They don't quit when it rains. They don't draft memos. They drive. You want to fire me? Fine. Do it at 12:01, but until midnight, this is my operation. Get out of my control room." The room went dead silent. The other executives stared, horrified. "You didn't speak to a senior VP like that." The VP's face turned violently red. He looked at Claire. "Are you going to let him speak to me like that?" Claire finally turned away from the window. She looked at the VP with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "Alexander told you to get out of his control room," Claire said. "I suggest you take his advice before I decide to review your expense accounts for the last 5 years. The VP swallowed hard. He looked around the room for support, found none, and practically jogged out of the double doors. Claire walked over to Alexander. She didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders had dropped a fraction of an inch. "Nice speech. I'm too tired for corporate diplomacy," Alexander muttered, checking the tablet again. Sunday, 23:15 hours, 45 minutes left. The rain was easing up, turning into a steady, freezing drizzle. Alexander stared at the screen. The GPS dots were clustering together. They were off the Autobahn. They were on the local industrial access roads, 10 miles out. "Call the yard manager," Alexander instructed the floor supervisor without looking up. "Open bays 1 through 75. Get the warehouse crews on the docks with the pallet jacks. I want them standing on the concrete." The supervisor scrambled to the radio. Sunday, 23:38 hours, 22 minutes left. Alexander pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. Claire stood beside him, her arms crossed tight across her chest. Down below, the heavy steel security gates of the Munich hub began to roll open. Through the mist and the dark, a pair of halogen headlights pierced the gloom. Then another pair. Then a dozen more. A massive, mud-caked Peterbilt rig rumbled through the gates. The engine brake roared, a deep, guttural sound that shook the glass of the control tower. Behind it, a convoy of 74 independent flatbed trucks followed, heavily tarped and strapped with heavy-duty chains. They didn't look like a corporate fleet. They looked like a mechanized army returning from war. They were covered in Lithuanian mud, Polish dust, and German rain. The lead truck hissed, the air brakes locking as it flawlessly backed into loading bay 1. The driver, a mountain of a man in a grease-stained jacket, hopped out of the cab, grabbed a clipboard, and slapped it against the warehouse supervisor's chest. "Time check," Alexander barked. 23:42, sir," the supervisor yelled from the radio console. "First pallet is crossing the threshold. We are officially in possession of the freight." They beat the penalty clause by 18 minutes. Alexander let out a breath. He leaned his weight against the glass. He felt like his bones were turning to ash. He had won. They had won. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned his head. Claire was looking down at the yard. A genuine, unguarded smile broke across her face. It was the first time Alexander had ever seen her truly smile. It completely transformed her, stripping away the armor of the billionaire CEO and revealing the brilliant, relentless woman underneath. "You did it, Alexander," she said quietly. "No," Alexander said, shaking his head. "We did it." Claire squeezed his shoulder once, firmly, and let go. "Go home. Get your daughter. I'll handle the paperwork." 3 weeks later, The dust settled, leaving a reshaped landscape in its wake. The legacy VP of Europe was gone. He had submitted his resignation on a Tuesday, heavily encouraged by a severance package that Claire had drafted with surgical precision. The Frankfurt bottleneck was officially a thing of the past. The Klaipeda reroute was codified into Montgomery Logistics Standard Operating Procedure as a primary contingency plan. The company had saved $12 million in fines, and Alexander's rogue trucking fleet was quietly absorbed into a highly lucrative, off-the-books retainer contract. It was a Sunday morning. The air in New York was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean bite of early winter. Alexander was sitting on a park bench in Astoria. He was wearing jeans and a thick wool sweater. No tie, no collar. The cheap thrift store suits had long been donated. Beside him, Maya was aggressively pumping her legs on a swing set, trying to reach the clouds. "Higher, Daddy," she demanded. "If you go any higher, I'm going to have to file a flight plan with the FAA bug." Alexander called back, standing up to give her a gentle push. He walked back to the bench and picked up a paper cup of coffee. He took a sip. It was good coffee. He could afford the good coffee now. A Blacktown car pulled up to the curb alongside the park. The tinted rear window rolled down and the back door opened. Claire stepped out. She wasn't wearing a blazer. She wore a long camel hair coat over a simple black turtleneck and dark jeans. She looked out of place in the neighborhood, yet entirely at ease in her own skin. She walked over to the bench, holding a small white paper bag. "I thought I might find you here," Claire said. Alexander smiled, genuinely surprised. "Ms. Montgomery, you're outside of the 10022 zip code. Do I need to alert security?" "Very funny," Claire said, sitting down next to him on the cold wooden slats. "I was in the borough looking at a new warehouse acquisition near the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Figured I'd swing by." "Sure. Just a casual Sunday drive through Queens." Claire offered him the paper bag. "I brought bribes." Alexander opened it. Inside were two massive, incredibly detailed dinosaur cookies from a high-end bakery in Manhattan. One was a T-Rex. The other was a Triceratops. "You remembered," Alexander said softly. "I never forget a consultant," Claire replied, her eyes drifting toward the swing set. "She's getting big. She's eating me out of house and home." Alexander chuckled. "But thanks to you, I can actually afford the grocery bill." "Don't thank me, Alexander," Claire said, her tone shifting, dropping the casual banter. "You earned every cent of that salary. You saved this company from its own arrogance." Alexander looked down at his coffee. "I just did my job." "No. You did what no one else in that building had the courage to do. You told me the truth." Claire looked at him, her dark eyes locking onto his. The intensity was still there, but the barriers were gone. "The people I work with, they spend their whole lives trying to impress me. They curate their resumes, they hide their mistakes, they hide their lives." She gestured toward the playground. "You walked in with formula on your collar and told me exactly how desperate you were. You didn't hide your baggage, you weaponized it. I respect that more than anything." Alexander held her gaze. He saw the loneliness that came with the empire she had built, the absolute isolation of being at the top, surrounded by sycophants and cowards. She needed an anchor. She needed someone who wasn't afraid of the gravel. "The offer stands, you know," Claire said softly. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What offer?" "If she gets sick," Claire nodded toward Maya, "I'll build the clinic in the lobby." Alexander let out a low laugh. It felt good. It felt like breathing after holding his breath for 3 years. "I appreciate the architectural commitment, Claire, but I think we're doing okay right now." "Good." Maya suddenly jumped off the swing, landing in a pile of wood chips. She spotted the stranger sitting next to her father and jogged over. her cheeks red from the cold. She stopped a few feet away, eyeing Claire suspiciously. Alexander knelt down. "Maya, this is my boss. Her name is Claire." Maya tilted her head. "Do you have the numbers for the dinosaur to eat?" Claire smiled. She reached into the paper bag and pulled out the T-Rex cookie. She held it out to the little girl. "No numbers today, Maya," Claire said gently. "Today, the dinosaur just gets to be a dinosaur." Maya's eyes went wide. She took the cookie with both hands. "Thank you." "You're very welcome." Claire stood up, brushing off her coat. "I have to get back to the city. The board wants to review the Q4 projections." "Tell them to bypass Munich," Alexander said with a smirk. "Oh, they know." Claire laughed. She looked at Alexander one last time, a silent promise hanging in the crisp air between them, a promise of partnership, forged in the trenches of survival. "See you on Monday, Director." "See you Monday, Claire." Alexander watched her walk back to the town car. The heavy door shut, and the vehicle merged seamlessly into the Queen's traffic, disappearing back into the machine. Alexander looked down at his daughter. Maya was happily devouring the head of the T-Rex. He didn't have a corner office in a glass tower, and he didn't have billions in the bank. But as he took his daughter's sticky hand and walked her back toward their apartment, Alexander Pendelton realized something profound. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And for the first time in a very long time, the road ahead looked entirely clear. Alexander's journey proves that the hardest trials, the stain on a collar, the crushing weight of single parenthood, aren't weaknesses. They are the ultimate proof of character. True strength isn't built in a boardroom. It's forged in the grit of simply trying to survive. If this story of resilience, unconventional brilliance, and a billionaire who finally saw the human behind the resume moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share it with someone fighting their own battles, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply grounded, unforgettable stories every single week.